Zookeeper mistreated a baby chimpanzee for show, unaware Shaq O'Neal was one of the tourists. The parking lot of Emerald Haven Wildlife Park stretched out, almost deserted, on a quiet Tuesday morning. A handful of yellow school buses stood parked in their designated spots, their bright paint vivid against the gray asphalt. A large signboard marked the park's entrance, towering over the mostly empty space. Shaquille O'Neal, better known as Shaq, stepped out of his car. Dressed casually, complete with a brown hat, he aimed to blend in as just another tourist. Pressing a phone to his ear, Shaq locked his car with a beep. "Yeah, I'm here now," he said, his deep voice carrying through the stillness. "I know it's early, but I'm trying to wrap this up faster than planned." The voice on the other end crackled with apology. "Sorry for the last-minute invite, Shaq, but you know how rare these reunions are. It's not every day we get all the NBA legends together like this." Shaq sighed, slowing his steps toward the entrance. His voice held the weight of his dilemma. "I know. I get it. It's a once-in-a-lifetime thing, and I'm trying to make it work. But I committed to this first, and I gotta stick to my word." His friend's tone softened. "We understand, big man. Just do what you can. It'd mean a lot to have you there, sharing old memories with the crew." Approaching the gate, Shaq spotted a staff member waiting. "Look, I gotta go," he said quickly. "I'll try my best to make it, even if I'm late." Ending the call, he turned his attention to the staff member, whose eyes widened slightly in recognition. "Mr. O'Neal," the staffer stammered, clearly caught off guard. "We weren't expecting you for another couple of hours." Shaq offered a polite smile. "Yeah, sorry about that. Something came up, and I didn't have time to call ahead. Thought I'd try my luck coming early." The staff member nodded, fumbling slightly as they reached for a walkie-talkie. "I see, let me just check with the owner. He's over at the vet clinic right now." While the staff member relayed Shaq's early arrival, Shaq's mind wandered back to the NBA reunion. He felt a pang of regret at the thought of missing it, reconnecting with old teammates, reliving glory days. But a commitment was a commitment, and he prided himself on following through. Snapping back to the present at the staffer's words, Shaq followed them down a winding path into the zoo. The quiet morning air carried the distant calls of exotic birds and the occasional low rumble of a big cat. The tranquility stood in stark contrast to the high-energy world Shaq was used to. "So," the staffer ventured nervously, "have you been here before, Mr. O'Neal?" "First time," Shaq replied, glancing around. "Heard good things, though." The staffer brightened. "Oh yes, we may not be the biggest zoo, but we take great pride in our animal care and conservation efforts." They rounded a corner, and the veterinary clinic came into view, a small, clinical-looking building tucked away from the main exhibit. The staff member gestured to the entrance. "Here we are. Mr. Gallagher is inside." Inside, the clinic's fluorescent lights illuminated neat rows of medical equipment. Through a large observation window, Shaq's attention was drawn to a scene unfolding in the treatment room. A tiny chimpanzee lay on an examination table as a young vet carefully administered an injection. Shaq moved closer to the window, his gaze fixed on the little primate. Its vulnerability tugged at him, sparking a mix of concern and admiration for the vet's gentle precision. The receptionist's voice broke his focus. "Mr. O'Neal, I can show you to the waiting area if you'd like." Shaq barely registered her words, his attention still on the tiny chimp. Inside the treatment room, the vet glanced up and froze, her eyes widening at the sight of Shaq watching. She quickly nudged the man beside her, who turned out to be the zoo's owner. The owner, Martin Gallagher, quickly washed his hands and stepped into the reception area, extending a hand. "Mr. O'Neal, I wasn't expecting you this early." Shaq shook his hand firmly. "Yeah, sorry about that. Something came up, and I thought I'd see if we could move our meeting up." Martin's expression tightened briefly before softening into a smile. "I see. Well, I appreciate your flexibility. As you can tell, we were in the middle of a routine checkup for one of our younger residents." Shaq's eyes flicked back to the window. "Is the little guy okay?" Martin nodded. Oh yes, just a routine vitamin booster. Young primates, like human kids, need extra care while their immune systems develop. Shaq smiled, visibly impressed. Good to hear. It's nice seeing you so involved with the animals' care. Martin's smile turned genuine. Thank you. We take pride in that. Shaq adjusted his brown tourist hat as he wandered through the tranquil pathways of Emerald Haven Wildlife Park. Despite his towering frame and celebrity status, he relished the rare chance to blend in among the scattered visitors, observing the zoo's atmosphere unnoticed. Passing the chimpanzee enclosure, he stopped to watch a group of mother chimps playing with their young. Their familial bonds were captivating, even across species. Yet, as Shaq admired the scene, he couldn't help but notice the limited space they had to move around. While the enclosure seemed well maintained, it was clear the animals could benefit from a larger area. Shaq's reflections were interrupted by the excited chatter of preschool children arriving nearby. Their teacher, a young man trying valiantly to corral his lively group, caught sight of Shaq. For a moment, surprise flashed across his face, but he quickly composed himself and approached respectfully. "Excuse me, Mr. O'Neill," the teacher said softly, extending his hand. "I hope I'm not bothering you. I just wanted to say I'm a big fan. Don't worry, I won't make a scene or anything. I understand how important quiet moments can be." Shaq smiled, shaking the man's hand. "Thanks, man. I appreciate that. Looks like you've got your hands full here." He nodded toward the energetic children, drawing a laugh from the teacher. "You have no idea," the teacher replied. "But it's worth it. Say, if you're interested, there's a chimpanzee show starting in about 15 minutes. It's supposed to be educational, talks about their intelligence and how similar they are to humans." "Thanks for letting me know," Shaq replied, making a mental note. Later, seated discreetly in the back row of the showroom, Shaq watched as the show began. It started off well, with the zookeeper sharing intriguing insights into the intelligence of chimpanzees. However, the presentation took a concerning turn when the keeper brought out a baby chimpanzee, introduced as Mellow. Shaq's brow furrowed. The chimp looked strikingly similar to the one he had seen in the clinic earlier. Could it be the same one? He wasn't sure, but an uneasy feeling settled in his chest. As the performance continued, Shaq's discomfort grew. Mellow, restrained by chains, was coerced into performing a series of tricks, riding a tricycle, waving to the audience, and balancing on balls. The young chimp's hesitation was palpable, its distress increasingly evident with each forced act. Hoping to distract the restless crowd, the zookeeper escalated the show with more elaborate tricks, some involving sudden surprises that clearly startled the baby chimp. Shaq clenched his fists, his unease now giving way to frustration. Was this really the care the zoo prided itself on? Shaq's concern grew as he watched Mellow's movements becoming slower and more lethargic. The baby chimp's eyes fluttered closed repeatedly, and its reactions to Greg's surprises were increasingly agitated. When Greg ushered the children forward to feed the chimp, excitement buzzed through the group as tiny hands clutched pieces of fruit and vegetables. Shaq, seated at the back of the event room, had a clear view over the crowd. His focus was locked on Mellow, whose posture was stiff and gaze wary. Each time a child extended their hand with food, Mellow glanced briefly at them, then turned its head away. When one boy nudged a piece of fruit closer to its mouth, Mellow let out a soft grunt of annoyance and retreated further. Crossing his arms, Shaq frowned. The hesitation, the lack of appetite, it all seemed too familiar. As Mellow glanced at the other chimps before retreating to a corner, its arms crossed in a distinctly human-like gesture of defiance or frustration. Shaq's mind raced. He was certain now that this was the same chimp he'd seen in the clinic earlier. Unable to ignore the nagging feeling any longer, Shaq stood abruptly, his towering frame drawing immediate attention. "Hey!" His deep voice echoed through the room. "What's going on here? That chimp looks sick." Startled, Greg squinted into the audience but didn't recognize Shaq in the dim light. "Sir, please sit down," Greg said, his tone stern. You're disrupting the show? Shaq's voice didn't waver. That animal's not well. This isn't right, you need to stop. You're putting the children and the chimp at risk. Greg's expression hardened. I told you to calm down. You're the one making everyone uncomfortable. The teachers, including Travis, looked on in shock. Travis finally stepped forward, gently guiding the children back to their seats as Shaq continued to press. What are you waiting for? Shaq demanded. Get the kids away and stop stressing that chimp. Greg's anger boiled over. Security, he barked. Escort this man out, now. As the guards approached, the room descended into chaos. Some children began to cry, frightened by the commotion. The teachers struggled to keep them calm, their faces filled with confusion. Shaq allowed the security guards to escort him out, but his mind was racing. Something was very wrong here, and he wasn't about to let it slide. As Shaq watched the event unfold, concern grew in his chest. Mello, the young chimp, moved sluggishly, his reactions slower and more lethargic than they should have been. The animal's eyes drooped, and its responses to Greg's attempts at engagement seemed increasingly agitated. While the zookeeper ushered children forward to safely feed the chimpanzees, the kids buzzed with excitement. Tiny hands clutched pieces of fruit and vegetables as they approached Mello on the presentation table. Shaq, sitting quietly in the back, had a clear view over the crowd. His height allowed him to observe the young chimp's body language closely. Mello's posture was stiff, his gaze cautious. Each time a child extended a piece of fruit, Mello glanced at it briefly before turning away. One boy nudged the food closer, but the chimp let out a soft grunt of frustration and retreated even further. Crossing his arms, Shaq's brow furrowed. The hesitation, the lack of appetite, it all felt disturbingly familiar. His eyes drifted to Mello's enclosure. The young primate sat in the far corner, arms crossed in what appeared to be frustration or defiance, almost human-like in its expression. Suddenly Shaq remembered. He'd seen this chimp before, at a clinic. The intelligent, observant eyes and wary demeanor were unmistakable. Unable to shake his concern, Shaq stood. His towering figure immediately drew attention, even in the dim lighting. "Hey!" he called out, his deep voice carrying across the room. "What's going on here? That chimp doesn't look well." Greg, startled, squinted into the audience, clearly not recognizing Shaq in the dim light. "Sir, please sit down," Greg replied, his tone tense. "You're disrupting the show?" Shaq wasn't about to back down. "That animal doesn't look right. You need to stop this now. You're putting the children and the primate at risk." Greg's expression hardened as teachers began pulling the children back from the presentation area. "Security!" Greg barked, his voice filled with frustration. "Escort this man out, he's disturbing the show." As chaos erupted and security approached, Shaq allowed himself to be led out of the room. But his mind was racing. Something was seriously wrong, and he wasn't about to let it go. Outside the event room, he found himself face to face with two burly guards, their stern expressions softening as they recognized him. "Mr. O'Neill," one of them said, his tone a mix of authority and respect. "We need you to leave if you can't enjoy the show quietly. It's meant for children." Before Shaq could respond, another voice cut in. "What's happening here?" Martin Gallagher, the zoo's owner, strode toward them, his expression filled with concern. As his gaze landed on Shaq, recognition flashed across his face. "Mr. O'Neill, is there a problem?" Shaq didn't hesitate. "Yeah, there's a problem. That young chimp in there, Mello, looks sick. He's chained up and forced to perform." "What's going on?" Martin's face paled. "I assure you, Mr. O'Neill, our animals receive the best care. There must be some misunderstanding." Shaq wasn't buying it. "Then why does Mello look drugged? And why is he doing tricks when he's clearly unwell?" Martin stammered before suggesting they move the discussion to his office. Though reluctant, Shaq agreed. Inside the office, Martin tried to offer reassurances, claiming ignorance of Greg's methods and promising immediate action. But Shaq remained skeptical, pressing for answers about the zoo's practices and finances. Martin admitted the zoo was struggling but denied any wrongdoing. Shaq, determined to ensure real change, pulled out his checkbook. "Here's a donation," he said. "But no more exploitative shows. Focus on education and proper care for the animals." Martin, visibly relieved, thanked Shaq profusely. But as Shaq left the office, he overheard Martin and Greg discussing their plan to sedate Mello further to avoid future incidents. Furious, Shaq confronted them, capturing damning evidence on his phone before leaving the zoo. Outside, Shaq quickly contacted his assistant, Derek, instructing him to forward the evidence to lawyers and media outlets. The story began unfolding on the news as Shaq drove away, determined to rescue Mello and hold the zoo accountable. Though his plans for the day had been derailed, Shaq knew he'd made the right choice, embarking on a new mission to protect animals in need.